This past summer, in the month of July, NATO got together with the leaders of all of the various countries to discuss the future of the organization, particularly in light of the war in Ukraine. And for the second year in a row, a number of countries from Southeast Asia were invited to attend the session. And once again, we found ourselves having a conversation about whether or not NATO should expand. Only this time, we're going to be discussing whether or not NATO should be expanding into the Southeast Asia or Pacific region. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am the director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy. Thank you for joining us once again as we have yet another one of our conversations with the Campbellsville University Senior Seminar class of 2023. I am joined by two of our exceptional scholars who are here today to discuss their views on whether or not NATO should continue its expansion, specifically whether or not NATO should continue its expansion as it moves towards enlargement into Southeast Asia. As they appear on my screen from left to right, we're joined by our first timer, Landon Cameron. Landon, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
And coming back, one of our seasoned professionals, Samuel Derrickson. Mr. Derrickson, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
So let's just go ahead and jump into this. I think for most of the people who are watching this, if they've tuned in, if they're here watching us, at 8:30 in the morning, or if they're live, or if they're streaming this later on, whether it be on YouTube or Facebook, they probably already know the answer to the question. But please explain to me what NATO is, and what exactly was NATO originally created to do?
I can start us off. So we can start with the basics that NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a collective defense organization, mainly among the United States and its European allies. And it was originally created in response to the Soviet Communist-aligned Warsaw Pact that was formed by the Soviet Union and its communist allies after World War II.
So you said it was created in response to a thing. What was the expectation of NATO? What was NATO supposed to do? What were they responding to?
They were supposed to provide a safeguard against Soviet aggression and Soviet expansion in Europe.
So that makes perfect sense. But Sam, help me out here. If NATO was created in response to the Soviet Union, and it was created during the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the Cold War ended a couple of years earlier. So why does NATO still exist if its purpose has expired before most of the people who are at Campbellsville University were born?
Yes, sir. Well, the answer to that would be NATO was created as a way to insulate the United States and its Western European allies from the Eastern Bloc and potential Eastern aggression. But we see that after the common thought at the time in the 90s, when the Soviet Union, when it broke apart, when it fell, when it collapsed, that NATO would go away because it no longer served a purpose. Its purpose solely was to protect from Eastern aggression, and at that point, there would be no more Eastern aggression, was the thought. So then you begin to see a shift in the justification and the goals of NATO, and it went from that to being considered a organization that had the sole purpose of spreading democracy. Some would say spreading capitalism, but spreading democracy from just Western Europe and North America into Eastern Europe, involving many of the former Soviet Union republics.
Yeah, I found that interesting. You said expanding democracy and then really kind of expanding capitalism. So we have here a map of the members of NATO, the most recent map, because NATO just recently expanded, I guess in the last 6 weeks. was the last round of NATO expansion. And as you look at the map, you can see that this kind of frontier are former communist bloc states. Would you call all the countries that are currently members of NATO democracies? Would you consider all of them to be capitalist? What do you guys think?
I would purposely say, as far as democratic, I guess that could be left up to interpretation to an extent. I know that at the time of their admittance, there has been at least two countries that were not democratic nations at the time, those being Portugal and Turkey. Some could argue that Turkey's still not a democratic nation, even though they hold an election every year. They've had a president for decades at this point, so that could be left up to interpretation. But certainly not democracies in the way that we understand them in the United States.
So I mentioned just a second ago that we've recently seen another round of NATO expansions. And in fact, there are a number of countries or a number of individuals that are suggesting that NATO should continue to expand. Talk me through, why did NATO just expand? Specifically, I think it was Finland that just recently came aboard. Why has NATO been expanding, and what are the arguments for NATO expansion? Landon, you want to go take a shot at that?
Yeah, well, the current round of expansion has mainly been in response to the Russian-Ukraine war. Russia, once again, was looking west into Europe, and that set off alarm bells among democracies, especially those that border Russia, such as Finland and Sweden. The general argument for expansion is that we live in a world of rising tensions, a world of rising authoritarianism, and that these countries may be looking again to expand, and Western democracies need to stick together in order to prevent that threat.
But when you think about that expansion, is it that they're looking to expand, or is Russia simply looking to reclaim? I mean, some can make the argument that returning to Ukraine is just simply that. It's not an expansion of Russian influence. They're just simply trying to take back what they lost, a little over 30 years ago.
Well, it would still be a war of conquest. They're still taking land and resources that are not internationally recognized as Russian.
Do you guys feel, so I guess what we want to turn to, now we understand a little bit about NATO, and that we understand a little bit about why it was expansion. That makes sense as it relates to Russian aggression. Is Russian aggression also the motivation for an expansion into Southeast Asia? Like, what is the logic behind the kind of Asian pivot that Obama had argued for, but never really actually attempted?
Well, at this point, Southeast Asia in general, is kind of one of the last frontiers. It's one of the last geographical, as far as if you going east, it's one of the last geographical frontiers that have not been conquered by NATO. There's also, with China and Russia's position geographically, there's great benefit, besides just as a countermeasure to Russian aggression, just having NATO allies, having countries in that part of the world. It's just a geographical advantage. It makes sense, especially with other happenings in that region, such as China's aggression towards Taiwan, things of that nature. It's kind of like the next step in the story, in the proverbial story.
Lyndon, do you concur? Is it about additional Russian containment, or do you think, as Sam kind of suggested at the end there, that this is really more about China?
Yeah, I would agree that it's more about China, specifically, like I said earlier, about rising authoritarianism. And the U.S. and its Western allies have recognized China as a threat not only to their countries themselves, but as a threat to the international rule-based order that has been established since World War II. There's also an economic element to the South China Sea specifically, in that a significant amount of world trade travels through that area, especially European trade.
Yeah, I probably should have provided a graphic for this, but you're referring to I guess what China calls the 9-dash line. China has recently laid claim to the South China Sea as being its territorial waters. And as one might suspect, whenever the United States and the NATO allies started talking about this Asian pivot, China was not particularly thrilled about the idea of seeing NATO expansion. Do you feel like the expansion into Southeast Asia makes sense for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or do you get the sense that there might be some challenges posed to NATO if they try to make that move?
Yeah, there would definitely be challenges. For example, the current NATO treaty only allows for the invitation of new members that are located on continental Europe. So that would obviously be the first major hurdle, is that the treaty does not allow for expansion into Asia.
Is that the only problem that it poses? I mean, it seems like that'd be a simple enough thing to do. All you would need to do is to get if NATO wanted to move into Asia, all they have to do is just change their charter.
Yeah, I think that it certainly makes sense for NATO if your goals are conquest and adding, rising economies and rising nations to your membership. If your goal is to strengthen your ranks and, have members come in that are only on the up and up, like South Korea, for example, other places. I'm sure we'll get into potential expansion nations, but it makes sense in that sense. It absolutely would make sense, and it would be beneficial. The problem is that what the likely response to it would be. I mean, we've seen what has happened in the Ukraine as a response to NATO, a potential NATO expansion into Ukraine, and how that led to the annexation of Crimea in eastern Ukraine, and all of the subsequent things that followed that, and where we are now in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, and it would likely result in the same thing if we were to expand into Asia.
I mean, that is an interesting point, because certainly Russia makes the argument that their invasion of Ukraine was caused by threats of NATO expansion, whether those were real or not. Do you feel that that's an accurate statement? And do you think that NATO, or that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was justified? I guess that's the first question. Do you feel that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was justified based upon the threat of NATO expansion?
I don't know about justified. I think that it depends on how you view Ukraine. Do you view Ukraine as in the same way that you did when it was a republic of the Soviet Union, or do you view Ukraine as a nation standing completely in its own sovereignty and being able to make its own decisions? I think that the U.S. certainly knew what it was doing and the potential effects of it, but justification of its actions and the thing that it's doing in Ukraine, I don't necessarily would say that, but it certainly seems like a response that was expected, to say the least. It certainly seems like a response that is, right on par with what the Kremlin and what Vladimir Putin was expected to do in response.
Lyndon, what do you think? Do you think that the argument that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a response to NATO expansion, do you think that it holds any water?
No, not at all. I think that provides a convenient excuse that plays well around the world. For Putin, that provides a convenient excuse, but I don't think it had anything to do with potential NATO expansion. The NATO invitation of Ukraine was proposed, but it was never seriously considered. No one expected that to go through, simply because Ukraine has been under constant threat from Russia, that would be too much of a risk for the NATO alliance to take on. So like I said, I think that is a convenient excuse for Putin, but it goes much further beyond a response to NATO expansion.
So as you mentioned, Sam, we're getting a little ahead of our story. What countries do you think would make for good candidates for an addition to NATO should NATO decide to make a move into Southeast Asia? Are there any that stand out, and why?
From during my research, what was prevalent to me was so like a country that already has economic alliances with the West would be Japan. Japan is a booming economy. It already is a part of the G8, which is a mostly European and North American alliance, economic alliance. So there's already a lot of long-standing economic ties and ties between the nations. So that would make sense. Also, another one is Korea. Korea is experiencing growth like no other, economically and in other ways. And where it sits is certainly, as far as geography, where it sits is certainly a place that you would want to have a foothold.
Yeah, I would say that definitely the top three targets for NATO expansion in Asia would be Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Specifically in the NATO meeting that you mentioned earlier in the discussion in July of this year, the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Japan was NATO's closest ally that was not in the organization. And all three of those countries have their own specific advantages to the alliance, but they also all have high levels of interoperability with NATO forces already. They already work closely with the United States and its allies.
And it seems that if you're thinking about bringing in Australia, you may as well go ahead and throw in New Zealand, since certainly New Zealand you would think would be a defensive front or a defensive fallback. And New Zealand and Australia's economies are so closely intertwined. So if you're thinking about, all this makes sense to me, right? So if you're thinking about NATO having more to do with economic protection than protecting land, those certainly are going to be the countries that the Europe is most dependent upon. Okay, so fine. However, there are certainly some threats here. So one of the concerns with adding Ukraine into NATO is that if you add Ukraine right now, you're immediately going to be getting yourself involved in a war with Russia. So that's kind of a non-starter. But if you add South Korea is still technically at war. There's an armistice, but they're still technically at war with North Korea. By inviting South Korea, aren't you also inviting conflict with North Korea?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, you are. And when there already is tension, it's dissipated to some extent, but certainly has been tension over the last few years with North Korea and its leadership. Kim Jong-un is in regards to America specifically. It's already been a very contentious, a very dramatic, kind of a relationship, if you could even call it a relationship. So yes, this would definitely, having South Korea would go a long way to furthering that divide and to creating even more conflict. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And historically, that's been a red line for NATO, that they don't allow ascension of these nations into the organization if they have ongoing conflicts or even territorial disputes with other major nations, especially nations that are already in the alliance, that they require those territorial disputes to be settled with those other countries before they're even allowed to join the organization.
As we mentioned a second ago, China obviously has a response to all of this. And so in July, Al Jazeera reported, in fact, that it was a resolute response to any NATO expansions. If NATO were to pursue, let's say, adding Japan, since Japan is, I think, probably a logical get, they're not involved in any kind of territorial conflict. They're not just simply a white nation or a European nation in the way that Australia or New Zealand is. If China were to consider, or I'm sorry, if NATO were to consider adding Japan, what do you think China's response would be, if any, to having NATO expanding on its borders?
Well, we could definitely see a range of responses in terms of economic sanctions or diplomatic protests or things like that. But one thing that I've seen mentioned a lot would be that the already increasing levels of cooperation between China and Russia would only accelerate with the expansion of NATO into Asia. China would be logically forced to seek to expand its alliances to maintain a balance of power in the region.
Do you think Russia would be the only country that would feel threatened in addition to China? I mean, obviously, they're already threatened on the Western front. Do you think that any of the other former Soviet republics that are located in the Pacific theater, would they be concerned about NATO expansion? Do you think India would have anything to fear from NATO expansion? Or do you think that it's just simply China's going to see this as Europe coming for them?
I think that it would raise concern amongst multiple nations, especially ones that have direct alliance to China and Russia, whether it be BRICS nations or the BRICS nations that are coming, which is a economic pact between Brazil, India, China, and South Africa and Russia too, as well, of course. And it's expanding into Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, a lot of nations that already hold very strong anti-West thoughts and feelings. So I think that in if you just get into the former Soviet nations, the former Soviet republics, Belarus, a lot of those nations would be heavily against NATO expansion. They see it as NATO's already went far enough east. Why would it go any further? What is the reasoning behind it? And many of them would believe that it's to spread, Western imperialism, to spread Western ideal, and they would take issue with that, of course.
In addition to that, so whenever I think about the problems of expansion, when NATO was a relatively small group of countries, it was fairly easy to establish and maintain cooperation and fairly easy to maintain military cohesion. As you expand NATO, is there any reason to think that it would be more difficult for the organization to operate if it were to add Asian countries? Or do you think that these Asian countries are already so in alignment with NATO core values or NATO core principles or NATO military doctrine that any additional expansion would have no effect on the organization itself?
There are definitely risks to expansion, especially beyond maybe the three countries that we mentioned earlier that are already so closely aligned with the U.S. But there is, like I said, a risk to adding countries that may not share the same values or goals or objectives with other NATO nations. And there has also been a concern expressed from European countries that they simply don't have the option to project power into Asia, so that this would simply be a U.S. burden on NATO, as they are the only country that could come to the aid or defense of these NATO allies in Asia.
But we already do, right? I mean, we already have troops that are stationed in South Korea. We already have troops that are stationed in Japan. We already have a fairly stable military alliance with Australia and with New Zealand. It sounds like, is the NATO expansion really just simply about appeasing the Americans? Or does Germany and France and Italy have a legitimate reason to want to be in Southeast Asia? What do you guys think?
I think, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. What's good for your allies is good for you most of the time. I think that, like you said, Dr. Williams, we already have pretty large naval installations and army installations in Japan and in Korea, South Korea, excuse me. I think that, it would just be kind of putting pen to paper in a lot of senses about adding these particular nations, because we already have so much influence in these nations. We already have so much military presence, economic presence, and things of that nature. So I think that what would be good for America would be good for Germany, would be good for, the nations that are already in NATO, economically and things like that, they may not want the stigma and what comes with NATO expansion, the negative light that would come with that, what it would be perceived as, what people would say that it is. They may not like that, but they would certainly like the benefits and would reap the benefits of an expansion.
Lyndon, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with the general sentiments of Sam that all Western democracies would benefit from the imposition of roadblocks on the path of authoritarianism around the world. And as we mentioned earlier, again, the economic interests that European nations hold in the South China Sea and the threat that China poses to those economic interests.
Now, thinking about expansion then, are there any countries in the region that you feel should be avoided for NATO expansion? I mean, either of those four or potentially any of the other countries in the region. As you just kind of take a look at the map, obviously South Korea and Japan are a little bit further north, but are there any areas where you think that NATO should just say, these are definitely no-goes, or are maybe those four countries already kind of off limits?
I would say there's definitely some specific examples. First of all, Taiwan would simply be too much of a risk for NATO to take on, and the United States hasn't even officially recognized them. So that would definitely be a red line. Some others that I see on the map would be Laos. They are very closely aligned with China. I don't think they'd have any interest in joining anyways. And then another specific country would be Myanmar, which has recently had an overthrow of their democratically elected government into a military junta. So those would be some specific examples of where I don't think NATO would want to touch.
Yeah, just to add another would be Vietnam. That is still to this day, if I'm not mistaken, considered a socialist communist nation of that ilk. So certainly Vietnam, who is already closely aligned with the Eastern powers, if you still want to call them that. That sounds very 1980ish of me, but very still closely aligned with the powers that be in the East.
Yeah, and speaking of Myanmar and Vietnam, obviously Rambo would be opposed to any kind of an expansion to those countries. But no, I joke. But I think that you're probably absolutely right. And I noted that I haven't seen serious consideration of India being added to the NATO alliance. Although one would certainly think that if you were trying to create a wall against China, India would be certainly a country that we would want to consider. But again, that brings with it its own challenges, and there are some legitimate concerns about the direction of democracy in India as well. So I guess final thoughts here. I'll go around to each of you one at a time. We'll start with you, Sam, and then Landon, you'll get the final word. In your opinion, after having done research on this for the last couple of weeks at least, do you guys feel that NATO should continue to look towards the East as a possible target of expansion? Do you think that maybe they should avoid it? Or do you think that potentially instead what should happen is some new organization, maybe a resurrection of CETO, some new organization should be developed where Northern European countries aren't included to provide a balance against China? Sam, you go first.
Yes, I think that the reason that NATO was constructed, and for all of the subsequent things that it's done, since NATO has a stigma, especially in the East, amongst its strong detractors in the East. NATO has a stigma. People fear NATO. People fear the imperialism of the West. People fear influence. People fear those things, especially in the East. So when you make moves as an organization, as NATO, it already sets off alarms for people in the East, for nations in the East, for leaders in the East. So I think that there may be, a benefit to, even if it was like a rebrand or something of that nature, it would make sense, because NATO expansion as we currently see it, I do not think that it's a good thing. I think that it would be wise of NATO to abandon its goals to spread eastward. It would be very wise. Look what has happened in Ukraine. Ukraine is just, we keep going back to it because it's just such a prevalent example. It's so, and like Landon said, that wasn't even necessarily a super real or a super prevalent thing. It wasn't on the books now. It wasn't going to happen now. And look what happened. Look at the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which many attribute to the expansion of NATO, the enlargement of NATO. So no, I don't think that moving east should be the goal. There's many other frontiers on this huge planet that you could spread democracy, spread your influence, that probably you wouldn't get as much pushback. Spreading eastward, you will get a lot of pushback, and we don't know what the severity of it could be. We don't know how far the Eastern powers are willing to go to stop this expansion and this enlargement. So no, I don't think that it would be intelligent, or it wouldn't be wise to push east.
Landon, how about you? Do you share the pessimism of Sam?
Not necessarily, not fully. I would begin by saying that NATO definitely has interest in Asia, and European countries themselves have interest in Asia, as we mentioned, the economic interest. But I'm not sure that NATO itself is the right organization. I think, as like you suggested, that a separate organization that would exclude some European countries that don't have the ability to defend countries in Asia, that a new organization would be better suited to supporting Western interests in Asia as an organization besides NATO.
Well, I guess that you have the final word on the matter. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me this morning in our conversation. And to the audience at home, whether you joined us for a live broadcast on YouTube or on Facebook, or if you're watching this as part of a streaming event, thank you very much for joining us. And we do hope that you join us again. We are actually taking a week off, which is very exciting for those of us who don't like getting up at 8:15 in the morning. We're taking a week off, but if you join us again in 2 weeks, on October the 10th at 8:30, we're going to be having a very, what I'm sure is going to be a lively conversation about the benefits of proportional representation. And specifically what we're going to be looking at is whether or not a switch to proportional representation might provide with greater efficiency and help the United States get out of some of the problems that it's having right now with the inability to create something as simple as a budget in our current House of Representatives. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. God bless.